everyone, Masha Kleiner here. Sometimes I feel I don't even need to say anything. I can just quote Orwell. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. Language matters. Words matter. Canadian singer J.P. Sachs sang "Our home on native land" instead of "Our home and native land" at the game in Los Angeles. If he doesn't think that Canada is a homeland for all Canadians, independent of race, he should pack his bags and leave, not to change the words of the anthem at his own discretion. Not to mention, J.P. Sachs is a Grammy nominee, but his singing was horrendous. Yet another indication just how messed up our world is. The lyrics of the Canadian anthem on the official government website are illustrated by a collage of a maple leaf and people. In the very center, there is a turban-wearing Sikh man. Next to him, there is a black woman and an Asian man. Smaller figures at the very top depict an older white man surrounded by a hand-carved Hindu woman and a hijab-wearing Muslim woman on the other side. The city of Powell River in British Columbia was established in the early 20th century and named after Israel Wood Powell, a 19th century federal Indian superintendent. The Tlamin Nation is now demanding the city be renamed to an Aboriginal name no one can pronounce or spell. Residents opposing the name change have faced threats, workplace discipline, and intimidation. Canadian political scientist Francis Widdowson argues that Powell was a relatively progressive administrator who promoted education for Indigenous children and had little direct role in residential schools. No man is perfect, but if we are to judge historical figures by modern standard, the Chief Makina Elementary School in Vancouver should be the first one to be renamed. Makina had 9 wives and 50 slaves and beheaded 27 captive sailors from the trading ship Boston. Hardly a role model for children. Instead, here are a few examples of schools that have been renamed in the last few years. Don Knott School, Oliver School, and Prince Charles School in Edmonton, Alberta were renamed. In Ontario, Sir John A. Macdonald School was renamed, and in Vancouver, Sir Matthew Bagby Elementary was renamed too. How many teachers can pronounce or even spell those names? How many hours are wasted teaching children to write this artificial alphabet? I mentioned Vancouver's Trudge Street renaming to Shmakwiemosem Street. What I didn't know back then was that the city of Vancouver paid members of the Musqueam Band to take part in discussions and the ceremony for the renaming that they themselves requested. Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act is a BC provincial law that excludes First Nations governments from the financial transparency requirements applied to provincial and municipal public bodies. The city of Vancouver demanded that the leaked disclosure about their payments to the Musqueam Band be taken down, which led to the Streisand effect, and this $33,000, a very modest amount compared to all other corruption cases, made international news. By the way, if you ever wondered how I typed the name of the street, Shmakwiosem, here is how. I Google Trudge Street renamed, and then copy and paste the new name from the article in the search results. I might do a more detailed overview of the legal steps that led us to today's misery, including the Indian Act, Section 35 of the Constitution, the Delgamilk case, and the Chicoltin ruling. In a nutshell, through a long chain of bad decisions, destructive ideology and self-flagellating slogans became reality. Could we expect that repeating every day that we live on stolen land would not lead to the land being taken away? I read many pseudo-expert opinions saying Aboriginal title can coexist with private ownership. As much as mainstream media and disingenuous intellectuals try to downplay the Cowichan decision, facts are indisputable. There are major concerns over mortgage renewals in Richmond due to the uncertainty of land ownership. A local Richmond manufacturing company was refused financing for a $100 million project. Loss of local business leads to loss of income. Loss of income inevitably leads to loss of private property. And that's not to mention an illegal, huge, environmentally dangerous dump of tires, ties, plastic, and demolition debris that was discovered on Cowichan Tribe's reserve land near the city of Duncan. The Cowichan freak show does not end there. The city of Richmond is appealing the decision. The provincial government is appealing the decision. Both the Tsawwassen Band and the Musqueam Band are appealing the decision. They have their own land claims over the same land. I wouldn't be surprised if the Cowichan Band appeals too. they claimed more land than they were granted. And guess who is paying all the legal bills? You guessed right, it's the BC taxpayers. There are 200 bands in BC. Most of them have land claims, and many of these claims are overlapping. And the insanity is snowballing. The Coquitlam First Nation is seeking hundreds of acres in Port Coquitlam. The federal government is negotiating with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh bands to increase their presence and involvement in Granville Island management. This is done in the spirit of reconciliation, which always means more payments to the band without any duties or accountability. In Quebec, the Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe Band has filed a lawsuit seeking Aboriginal title for 8 areas and $5 billion in compensation. And now another band is claiming Kamloops and the Sun Peaks Resort and the surrounding area. To make things more comical, the US Colville tribe is suing BC for violating their constitutional rights. You see, some of the tribe's ancestors migrated to the US from Canada nearly a century ago, and today they demand to be consulted on school curriculum and project development. It's not an implausible assumption that their next lawsuit will involve the land claim too. There is a major flaw within the Canadian Constitution. Unlike the US Constitution, ours does not protect private property rights. The City of Vancouver approved free parking for local Indigenous bands in Stanley Park and plans to expand this to more parks and sites. In other parks, for example Bilkara Park, there are spots designated to the local band members already. When I posted about this, comparing it to the only white signs in the US during segregation, some commentator called me a racist and demanded that I go back to Europe. But the comments that surprised me most were those comparing race-based parking to disabled parking, pregnant women parking, private parking, and suggesting I should indulge Indigenous people with this minor favor of free parking. After all, haven't they suffered so much already? I disagree with the premise itself. There is no such thing as reasonable small racism. No historical suffering justifies race-based discrimination. And leaving out of the discussion the extent and the source of this alleged Indigenous suffering, I would be similarly outraged by Jews-only parking next to the Bundestag. Words matter. The terminology evolved from Indians to natives to Aboriginals to Indigenous. Then, in the recent years, the more popular term became First Nations. I do not like the choice of the words. Nation implies nation building, institutions, governance, and most importantly, responsibility. In April, a member of Skyet Gate Band, which is part of the so-called Haida Nation, was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for a targeted fatal hit-and-run. In response, the Haida leadership banished 8 family members from the community and 2 homes were demolished. Local businesses on Haida Gwaii refused to serve the family members. Demonstrators pursued them off the island, prevented them from obtaining food, fuel, or accommodations, forcing the RCMP to step in. And no, this wasn't an outburst of grassroots anger. This move was endorsed by First Nation leadership across the province as a return to traditional law and a major shift in addressing crime internally. Traditional law also allowed Indigenous tribes to trade slaves. Traditional law is in no way superior to the modern law. Moreover, for Canada to be viable as a country, we must have the same laws for all people. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Since 1999, the Gladue principle guides Canadian courts to reduce sentences for Indigenous offenders. Holding people to lower standards leads to lower outcomes. 2 chiefs of the Tsuut'ina Nation in Alberta are still nominated for re-election despite having been charged with historical sexual assault. In 2025, BC introduced a new diversion program that offers non-violent Indigenous offenders a 90-day therapeutic program as an alternative to criminal prosecution. The program aims to reduce the over-incarceration of Indigenous people. Only a reduction in crime should lead to reduction in incarceration. If this is a good rehabilitation program, it should be offered to offenders of all races. Otherwise, this race-based impunity will bring more crime and more incarceration of Indigenous people. The sad irony is that most crimes against indigenous people are committed by indigenous people, and most indigenous offenders commit crimes against their own people. The Canadian justice system doesn't just favor indigenous offenders. In Quebec, Omayama Choi pleaded guilty to leaving Canada to participate in ISIS activities and received 1 day behind bars and 3 years probation. Noise fines were cancelled for pro-Hamas protesters in Ottawa. The endless 2-year-long pro-Hamas protests all over the country are not even closely comparable in levels of aggression and disruption to the peaceful Freedom Convoy. And yet, in comparison, the prosecution sought 7 and 8 years for Freedom Convoy leaders Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. Lich spent 49 days in pretrial custody. Both were sentenced to 12 months of house arrest, followed by months of curfew. NDP MP Leah Gazan has reintroduced the bill that criminalizes residential school denialism, with the maximum punishment of 2 years imprisonment. She already introduced this bill a year ago. It passed first reading and was terminated once Parliament was prorogued. Some people like to compare residential schools to the Holocaust. There was never anything even remotely resembling the Holocaust in Canada. I am saying it now while it is still legal, and I will continue saying it even if it is criminalized. There was no genocide, no cultural genocide, and nothing fundamentally evil in the residential school system. Of course, there were some teachers that were mean and abusive. Just like in today's school, some teachers are mean and abusive. Despite numerous claims, not a single clandestine burial of children has been discovered at any former residential school. Despite hundreds of millions of dollars allocated to various bands for excavations, digging only happened in one school in Manitoba, where no remains were found. At the most infamous school, the Kamloops Indian Residential School in BC, not a single shovel has touched the ground. Making a Killing, Reconciliation, Genocide and Plunder in Canada is a One BC Caucus documentary that explores residential schools and land rights in detail. The movie trailer and several teasers are available to watch, and the full documentary should be ready in a few weeks. I digressed. Some people like to compare residential schools to the Holocaust. There was never anything in Canada even remotely resembling the Holocaust. But even the people who deny the irrefutable horrors of the Holocaust should not be imprisoned. Here is another key flaw in the Canadian Constitution. It has no equivalent to the US First Amendment. Our freedom of speech is limited and not fully protected. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and see you next time.